most recent structural innovation within UPF has been the creation of a set of associations dedicated to collaboration among leaders from various fields. These pillar associations are: the International Summit Council for Peace was initiated by UPF co-founder Dr. Hak Jahan Moon in 2019 on the occasion of World Summit 2019 in Seoul, Korea. ISCP is an international network of current and former heads of state and government. The International Association of First Ladies, IAFLP, a project of the ISCP, affirms and uplifts the unique role of First Ladies in contributing to peace and development. IAFLP brings together current and former First Ladies from throughout the world, drawing upon their experience and wisdom as women leaders and as role models who serve their countries in significant ways. The International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, IAPP, is a worldwide association of parliamentarians which provides a forum to bring their experience and wisdom to bear in the search for solutions to our world's problems. UPF maintains that any successful strategy for peace must take into account the spiritual dimension of our human identity, experience, and interactions. Based on this worldview, UPF initiated the Interreligious Association for Peace and Development, IAPD. The International Media Association for Peace, IMAP, represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media. IMAP recognizes the vital role that journalists play in providing objective reporting to foster an informed citizenship. The International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP, is a global interdisciplinary academic initiative aimed at contributing toward the realization of a world of lasting peace. IAAP is dedicated to building professional networks for academicians to foster a world of peace. The International Association for Peace and Economic Development, IAED, affirms the role of businesses, business leaders, and investors to make the world a better place.
Thank you. And then today's program, let's begin here. Today's program is part of a series that IAED has launched under the title of Toward a Headwind Economy of Freedom, Peace, and Shared Prosperity. We seek to bring you in this forum an understanding of the scale and nature of the decline in global fertility rates and why some economists have called this the most crucial economic issue of our time. What are the most serious consequences economically if this trend is not reversed? We will hear about barriers to family formation, child rearing, and the erosion of marriage as a cultural norm. Our speakers will discuss short-term economic and political policies that are now being tested in some countries or others that could be implemented to incentivize more births. Finally, what are the long-term cultural challenges and opportunities that nations face in creating a supportive, family-centered culture and economy? Why are strong marriages seen as a key, even by economists, actually, seen as a key to reversing the decline in fertility rates? Our speakers have a great passion for this issue and extensive expertise. Two of them have recently returned from speaking in Hong Kong at a forum on global fertility crisis. So again, I'd like to thank you for spending this time with us, and especially to our panelists for giving of your time during these off hours. And so with that, I'd like to invite up our first speaker, Mr. Daniel Hess. So Daniel Hess is a data analyst, engineer, and pronatalist advocate, renowned for creating and writing the widely followed At More Births account on X with over 45,000 followers, and he writes on Substacks where he dissects the global fertility collapse through empirical data and evidence-based solutions. Drawing from his high-tech background, Hess, a father of 6, living in Washington, D.C. area, explores drivers like cultural individualism, urban density, and policy gaps, framing low birth rates as civilization's greatest threat. He frequently guests on podcasts, including Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning and Aaron Wren's Urban Future to discuss fertility trends and reversal strategies. The title of Dan's talk is The Great Crisis of Low Birth Rates Threatening Our Future and the Biggest Levers to Reverse It. So thank you, Dan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Here, I'll go ahead and share this here. All right. The low birth rates is the greatest crisis we face here. Economist Jesus Fernandez Villaverde of the University of Pennsylvania says, if we are unable to address our fertility crisis, there will be an economic crisis that could have an impact measured in the quadrillions of dollars. From the perspective of the economy alone, we're looking at something that could be completely devastating culturally and along many other facets. So I just got back from Hong Kong, which attending with another panelist, Lyman Stone, and a number of other researchers and demographers, the Global Fertility Crisis Forum. It was my first time in Hong Kong, a beautiful city, but I was left with the awareness that Hong Kong is actually dying out. The fertility rate in Hong Kong most recently in 2025 was 0.74 births per woman. To give some perspective, as most of you may know, the replacement fertility is approximately 2.1 births per woman. So we're looking at each generation being only 1/3 of the size of the generation before. 100 people having just 12 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. This incredible city that I saw for the first time is dying out. Now, seeing the fertility crisis is very difficult for a lot of people. We see people everywhere. We hear that the global population is at an all-time high. What's the problem? And I have 2 charts to demonstrate why this is a serious problem and why we have such a hard time seeing it. On the chart on the left is what we see when we look at South Korea's total population. South Korea's total population is not far from its all-time high. But if you look at a population pyramid, you see something completely different. You see that the younger generation is almost completely missing. There's very, very few children. And we use the term population pyramid, but you can see for South Korea and many, many other countries, it's completely inverted. There are very few children and a very dim future for that country and so many others. Another question people ask, can't we just envision a world where there's fewer people but we're all more prosperous? We can talk about that, but that's not what we actually see. When we see places that are depopulating, we see blight and decay. On the left, somebody took a sadly abandoned village in rural Japan and peopled it with dolls, make it kind of resemble what it once did. And on the right, we see Detroit, a city in the United States which has been sharply depopulating. All over the world, when you see depopulation, you don't see some kind of fewer, more prosperous people. You see blight, you see decay, you see decline. And that's historically the case as well. Historically, civilization itself tracks populations. What we think of as the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, was really a decline in population. And when you lose population, you lose economies of scale, you lose technology, you lose so many of the markers of civilization. When you have long-run depopulation, you can see civilization itself move backwards. That's very hard to imagine, but that's the reality that we face. And this is particularly a problem with the most advanced and most prosperous countries. Here's a startling fact to consider. The 44 countries of Europe, including Russia, now have fewer children born every year than just one African country, Nigeria. So that entire green area that covers most of Eurasia has fewer births than one country that has higher fertility. That really shows how shockingly far along the birth rate crisis is. And now Nigeria is extremely poor. Its economic production per capita is only 1/100th that of the United States or leading European countries. Are poor countries like that going to somehow carry the world in the future? That seems like an unlikely prospect. The fertility crisis keeps getting worse every year. Out of more than 100 countries that have fallen below replacement since 1950. Only two returned to have above replacement fertility. Those two are Mongolia and Kazakhstan. All of the rest of the countries that have fallen below replacement in the last 75 years have remained below replacement. So it's almost entirely true that countries that fall below replacement have been stuck below that level. Is there any way to turn things around? What are the biggest levers that can lift birth rates? That's something I try to talk about a lot in my X account. The first thing is a pronatal culture. In my view, the most important factor is pronatal culture. Very simply, do people believe in the fundamental goodness and importance of having children? So there's only one well-developed country in the world that maintains above replacement fertility, and that's Israel. It's crowded, very educated, and has more women's education than men's education, high tech, and this is the profile of a low fertility country, and yet somehow it maintains high fertility. So if you study this hard, if you talk to lots of people, if you look at fertility desires, you find that Israelis just directly believe that having children is the most important thing. It's a national mission. From the founding of Israel, all the leaders urged people to have children. In the religion, it's important, and everyone has a strong consensus that whatever you do in life, having children is one of the things that you have to accomplish. Another strong example of the value and importance of direct pronatal culture, that is direct belief in the importance of having children, is the contrast between Mongolia and China. Now they are adjacent countries, yet Mongolia remains well above replacement, while China is approximately one-third the level of Mongolia. In 2025, China fell firmly below one child per woman, so China is among the very lowest fertility countries in the entire world now. So you have this incredibly sharp contrast between Mongolia and China, and why is that? Well, very simply, one country was maintaining a culture of celebrating children, celebrating mothers, and maintaining the belief that having children is incredibly important for the future of the country. The other had strict population control, along with messages telling people that it's bad to have children, it's bad to have a lot of children, we need to have fewer children. So that simple message permeating through the culture for years and years, for decades and decades, resulted in a completely different mindset around having children. And Mongolia now has a bright future, and China has a future that is rapidly dimming. But we can look within China. There's one region of China under the leadership of a governor who is actually the father of the current premier of China. They had a two-child policy, and now to this day there remains much higher fertility in the Guangdong province where this man was governor. So merely having a very strongly different cultural message, a different way of talking about the value of children, and just a different attitude toward children in that one province results in an incredibly visible difference in the total fertility rate today. The second very large factor that I want to talk about is marriage. The difference in fertility between low marriage and high marriage countries is 2 times. And there's not a single country that achieves above replacement fertility with low marriage rates. So toward that end, we need to try to sell young people on marriage, and actually that should be an easy task. Married people are happier, married people are healthier, married people are wealthier, married people live longer. So by all the metrics, marriage is a very good thing for people, and it should be an easy sell, but we've done a very poor job selling it. And this was a point that I shared in Hong Kong. Hong Kong in East Asia, has particular cultural norms and cultural history. I talked about arranged marriage in East Asia in particular. Virtually 100% of coupling of marriages in East Asia used to form by arranged marriage and matchmaking, and that has virtually disappeared as a form, and young people are having a very poor time in those countries, matching. And it is a very interesting point related to that to point out. In Israel, there is a vital and vibrant matchmaking culture. So it really seems that old historical norm could have a place again in the future. The next point To continue on marriage, it's not enough to have a marriage culture, but marriage has to be early enough. We've had this very strong trend toward later partnering, later marriage. That was just highlighted in the New York Times today in two separate articles. And this trend toward very late marriage is a very strong association with lower fertility. And we have on the right, we can see what the fecundability curve really looks like from a paper by Michael Garuso et al., published in 2023. The fecundability curve, that is the ability to get pregnant, is very steeply age dependent, far more than anybody realized. This was a shock to almost everybody that saw this, that actually the ability to get pregnant peaks at age 20 and is already dramatically lower by age 30. People think that maybe by 35, 37, fertility starts to drop off. By that time, the ability to get pregnant is dramatically reduced. The next major factor, I want to talk about is religiosity. And again, some of this content was shared very recently in Hong Kong. And, speaking actually to a Chinese audience facing a great fertility crisis, China does not have religious freedom. And that's, in my opinion, no small reason why China's fertility is so incredibly low. Almost all the research says the same thing. Religiosity has a very large impact on fertility, particularly when a particular faith directly teaches the importance of having children. And if we want to really, see a twofold or threefold increase in fertility and not just dabble at the edges, we have to really talk about these large drivers, and religiosity is one of the largest. If you look at the 13 colonies, there was a very diverse array of religious foundations, and America from its founding until about 1900 showed the fastest demographic growth of any country in history. And I really think the evidence shows that a lot of that had to do with the fact that America was a very religious country. America, a country founded on religious freedom, and really had actually round after round of great awakenings. And so the intense, certainly compared to Europe, America's very much a stronger religiosity played a very powerful role, demographic success and its demographic growth. During the 1800s, when America was growing at an unbelievable clip, Europe was growing orders of magnitude more slowly, and one reason for that was that America was really much more religious than Europe, and a big reason was its culture of religious freedom. Many of the most fervent groups in Europe actually came to the United States to find religious freedom. And a wonderful study by another of our panelists here today, Lyman Stone, actually looked at the powerful impact of religiosity in Georgia, and particularly how an influential religious figure, the Patriarch of Georgia, was able to personally, single-handedly create a baby boom in that country simply by encouraging families to have more children and offering to personally baptize every third child or higher. And the evidence showed that it was among Orthodox women that there was a staggering increase in the fertility rate, really brightening the Republic of Georgia's outlook and their future.
Wrap up in a couple of minutes, Daniel. Thank you.
Okay, I'll wrap up very quickly. The last thing I wanted to talk about is housing. Housing is another very big factor, but it's a little bit different from what most people realize. And let's use the example of London. London has very excellent fertility data district by district, but what we're going to see in London is true around the world. Where people live in the urban core of London, you see a fertility rate of just 0.55 births per woman, which is an astonishingly low level, lower than any East Asian country. But then when we get out to the leafy suburbs of London, you see a fertility rate of 1.5 to 2, so 3 to 4 times higher than in the urban core, which really shows the fact that housing type and the size of the housing is really the driver that we need to think about for fertility. Is housing appropriate for families much more than is it affordable? Affordability does matter, but it's not the main thing. The main thing we need to focus on is whether housing is suitable for families, and it turns out that suburbs are a wonderful model. Another point that I want to talk about, again, looking at this fecundability curve, but in that wonderful paper, the easiest lever and the most powerful lever, I think, to really reverse fertility decline is to educate young people very early, even in high school, about how important it is to really prioritize family very early in life. Sex ed almost entirely focuses on how to avoid pregnancy and almost not at all on how to build a family, even though it is much more likely today that people will reach the end of their fertile years not having the family that they had hoped to have rather than having unintended pregnancies. So the problem of unplanned childlessness is actually much more severe now than the problem of unplanned pregnancy, yet sex ed is focused entirely on the latter issue and not at all on the problem of unplanned and unexpected childlessness. So the conclusion that I draw is there are a lot of individual factors which are very powerful levers that are related to fertility, and I want to end by talking about one success story that is local to a lot of us. I am one state away from the biggest Amish population in the world, and the Amish happen to have the highest fertility on the planet, higher than any other group in the world. And they're really worth studying, and they really hit a lot of these factors perfectly. They have very strong pronatal belief. Having children is high status. They have a very high marriage rate, and they tend to marry early, 21, 20, 22 years old. They are very religious, and they are also spread out on the land in a type of housing that is really perfect for perfectly suitable for families. And we don't have to become Amish to learn from them in a lot of different ways. And as bad as the crisis is, and it is very severe, there is hope. And we see it in a group right in our midst.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. If you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I think that's the best place, and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end. I'd like to invite up our next speaker is Dr. Lyman Stone. And Dr. Stone is an American demographer and public policy commentator. He currently serves as director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies, and he is the director of research for the population consulting firm Demographic Intelligence in Charlottesville, Virginia. He also serves as research director at the population consultancy Populi Information. He's received his PhD in sociology in population dynamics at McGill University, researching topics including fertility intentions and realization, fertility policy, and family formation. He focuses on the cause of low fertility and the policy toolkit of taxation, housing, childcare, marriage, and family structure, etc. He emphasizes that policy can, under certain conditions, raise birth rates, and advocates using the realization of families' desired number of children as the core metric for evaluating family policy effectiveness. As head of the Institute's Pronatalism Initiative, he organizes cross-national evidence reviews and policy design. Title for Dr. Stone's talk today is Causal Factors of the Fertility Gap, Its Threat to Economic and Social Stability, Pronatalism Policies, and What Needs to be Done. So thank you. Lyman, please share with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I do apologize if there's some background noise while I talk. I am giving this presentation from an airport, so hopefully I don't get too much TSA noise coming over. As you can see, the title that I was listed as was quite long, so I went with a pithier one. So why fertility falls and what needs to be done. And just in the interest of time, I decided to try and keep the focus here pretty straightforward through a limited set of causes, problems, and solutions. It's not going to be a comprehensive review of everything in this area. I think actually what Dan just did was much more comprehensive in covering the breadth of the issue than what I'm going to do here. What I'm going to talk about is why fertility is falling so much, particularly with a view to the East Asian context, which is so interesting because it is so low. And then I'll talk about what can be done about that. So let's see if my screen will get full. There we go. Okay. So just to start with, the question we would want to ask is what explains the great variation in fertility between high-income countries or industrialized countries. Obviously, Mongolia is not as high income as the USA, but it's a relatively industrialized country with a high life expectancy, high educational attainment. Israel as well. Thailand also has relatively average life expectancy, education attainment, low infant mortality. Then, of course, Korea, Taiwan. And the point here is, in a country like Israel or Mongolia, you can expect each generation to be 30, 40, 50% bigger than the previous one. Whereas in Korea, you could expect it to be only about 30 or 40% of the size of the previous one. This is a huge difference in the implied pace of natural population change. And it's incumbent, therefore, to figure out why is it that all these countries where people basically work, contract wage jobs in formal employment sectors, where, in all these countries, like, women have the right to vote and own property and divorce, these things. Why is fertility so different among these relatively industrialized modern societies? So a second question that I'm going to get to near the end is this interesting little thing that's happened in Korea in the last 2 years. While fertility has been falling, in fact, the pace of fertility decline has actually accelerated in much of the rest of East Asia in the last couple of years. But Korean fertility has actually, maybe for the time being, bottomed out and seems to be rising a bit. So we're going to look at what might be happening there. So to do this, the first thing we want to ask is, what makes a society good for having kids? In fact, how would we even know if a society is good for having kids? I would suggest the first and foremost way we would do that is by looking at marital specific fertility rates. So we want to say, okay, of people who are married, partnered, co-residential, and 27, what are their odds of having a child? Or whatever. So we look at age-specific fertility within marriage. And that's what this graph is for 5 countries. What I want to draw your attention to is that Mongolia and Israel, I showed you a second ago, have very similar fertility rates overall across the whole society. But Israel has much higher marital fertility than Mongolia does. We'll see why that is in a bit. But the point is, in some ways, Israel is actually a place where more married couples are choosing to have babies. Whereas in Mongolia, there's just more married couples, okay? If you look at Japan, that's that orangish line, you can see that the average Japanese couple of a given age has a higher likelihood of having a child than the average American couple of the same age, even though the US on the whole has higher fertility. What's going on here? Well, the US has much higher marriage rates to some extent, particularly at younger ages. The US also has higher non-marital fertility, so that's a bit of a separate thing. But my point here is you can often find countries that have very similar overall fertility rates, but how they get there is very different. Some countries may be a wonderful place to have a baby if you're at a place to make that decision, but not a lot of people are at the place to make that decision. And we'll come back to that. Another thing I want to point out, this is just an example from Taiwan. Increasingly, the fertility rates of women who have ever been married are separated from the fertility rates of women generally. So you can see in Taiwan, it used to be that the ever married fertility rate and the all women fertility rate were virtually identical, but increasingly they are separated such that now it's very likely that the ever married completed fertility rate is maybe about 1.8, 1.85 in Taiwan, whereas the overall completed size is probably about 1.2 or 1.3. That's a big difference. That's almost half a child between the ever married group and the overall population. That suggests marriage is having an enormous regulatory impact on the fertility rate. So what I do here is I take these marital fertility rates, these within marriage fertility rates, and I just show them as a percentage of Israel's value, because Israel's the highest. And then I also look at just the overall total fertility rate as a percentage of Israel. And you can see that there's really no correlation. In fact, one of the highest marital fertility rates in Asia is really in the world, is in Taiwan. Okay? Taiwanese couples, once they get married, they have babies. Okay? It's just they take a very long time to get married. Whereas if you look somewhere like the US's actual marital fertility rate is not that high. But we have a lot of non-marital fertility and relatively high transition into marriage. Korea has relatively high marital fertility, but very low overall fertility. And we're going to see why that is in a bit. But my point here is that the places that are the kinds of places where couples decide to have kids, that is where marital fertility is high, are not always the places that have the highest overall fertility. because couple formation is itself a separate, independent regulatory factor on fertility. So here we're just looking at the number of reproductive years that women spend in marriage across time in some of these societies. You can see that Korea and Taiwan in particular have had a rapid decline, whereas Mongolia remains quite high. Mongolia just has a lot more marriage than Japan does. So if we look at the marriage share, so now we're comparing the TFR as a percentage of Israel's to the marriage share as a percentage of Israel's. We see, except for the US case, it's a much stronger correlation. Why is Japanese fertility higher than Taiwanese? Because there's more marriage in Japan than there is in Taiwan. Why the US is a bit different, again, because there's a lot of non-marital fertility, but why is Mongolia so much higher than the other places? It's because Mongolia has more marriage than the other places. It's just a question of coupling. So what we've learned so far, couples are still deciding to have kids in Asia at pretty high rates, but fewer couples are forming. And this is a possible candidate explanation for fertility decline. So we can actually simulate this in the case of Korea pretty easily because we have good data. We can say, okay, imagine it's the year 2000, and instead of the actual history that we've experienced, the share of women that were married did what it really did in history, but birth rates by age and marital status were chained at their 2000 levels. So basically, the decision parameter about whether or not to have kids based on age and marital status is held fast at the 2000 levels, but the share of population that's married changes just like it does. That's the gray line. You see, the gray line is actually lower than what actually happened. What that tells us, very simply, is that actually Korea's fertility rates for a given age and marital status have gone up. Even as Korea's overall fertility rate has gone down, the people in a position to decide to have kids have actually been more likely to decide to have kids, which I think is because Korea has been doing a lot of stuff to make having kids better. More financial incentives, more various programs to support families. A lot of this has been happening in the last 15 years. The orange line is, what if you did the opposite? What if you said, okay, birth rates fluctuate exactly the way they did in real history, but the married share is chained to its 2000 level. What you can see is, if there had not been a decline in marriage, births in 2023 would have been pretty much the same as what they were in 2000. 100% of the decline in Korea's births can be explained by the change in the share of people who are married. That's it. 100%. The entire decline in births is explicable just through changes in the rate at which Korean people are falling in love and getting married. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the whole causal factor, because causality is a kind of different question. This just means descriptively, we can explain it this way, we can decompose it this way. So what we've learned so far here is if the marriage rates of 2000 had been stable, Korea would have had 2.4 times as many births in 2023. Fertility rates within marital status actually rose over time, even as Korea's overall fertility rate fell, which should tell us that Korea kind of became a better place to have kids if you have a partner to have them. That's the real problem. So if it's marriage, if it's really just about marriage, should we even care about pronatal policy? We don't need to nudge people to have more kids. We just need them to get married. And I want to push back against that a little bit. There's 4 reasons. We should care about direct pronatal policy. That is, policies aimed at having babies for 4 reasons. First, helping families is just a good idea anyways. Families do vital work for society. They create public goods for society. Helping them is good. Second, bigger families can partially offset low marriage. So Korea's fertility would have fallen much more if marital fertility rates had not risen. So the fact that couples in Korea that did get married increased their fertility rate suggests that we can partially offset rising singleness with bigger families of those who do marry. Third, some people might be postponing marriage because they don't think they can afford kids. Making kids more affordable might induce them to consider marriage. And finally, and this is something I want to emphasize, cures don't always have to fix causes. There are multiple people on this call right now who are wearing glasses. Bad eyesight is caused by age and genes, sun exposure. And when people have bad eyesight, we don't go in and reverse their age edit their genes and undo their sun exposure. We put glasses on them, or contacts, or LASIK. Cures don't always have to fix causes. Just because declining marriage is the cause of fertility decline doesn't mean that the solution has to be raising marriage back to 2000 levels. There might be other solutions. We might be able to increase fertility within marriage, for example. So if we did want to boost marriage and births, how would we do it? And here we're going to use Korea as our example for some fancy math. And I'm not going to bore you too much with the exact math. Suffice to say, the estimates here are coming from an unpublished meta-analysis. It's going to be published in a volume from the University of Chicago later this year from 157 different empirical studies of how cash influences fertility. So we have lots of countries that have given people money to have babies, and then we study what happens. And so we can come up with a standard exchange rate, so to speak, between dollar bills and babies. And I know that might sound like a very strange thing to say, but the truth is humans are rational beings. They follow goals. If you pay them to do something, they tend to do more of it. So let's go through this. I have Japan and Taiwan there just as examples. Then I have the light blue bar here for Korea's actual fertility rate in 2025. Then we ask, what if Korea doubled its monthly child allowance? Right now you have a 100,000 won a month child allowance in Korea. What if you doubled it to 200,000? Fertility would go up to 0.82. That's not a big effect. Okay, what if the baby bonus, because Korea recently implemented a baby bonus of 2 million won per kid. What if you raised it to 11 million won per kid? Well, fertility would go up to 0.86. Again, that's a pretty modest impact. We can look at its wage replacement. Korea did just increase the wage replacement rate for maternity leave and paternity leave. If you increase that by a similar amount, these four policies I show, by the way, the reason I designed these ways is because these are policies Korea already has, and I made sure that they all cost the same amount. All of these policies have similar budgetary costs. They cost 0.1% of GDP. Okay, 0.1% of GDP. Or put another way, they cost 0.4% of the government budget. So taxes would have to go up 0.4% to pay for these. Now you can see at the back end, Korea actually already has a lot of pronatal policies. If they didn't exist, we can also say, what would fertility be? And the answer is, it would be very low. It would be about 0.5, 0.6. So Korea's pronatal policies are already elevating fertility above what it would be without them. So the problem is, as you saw, those effects were pretty small. So maybe it's too expensive. Maybe all these cash policies are just too expensive and we shouldn't bother with them because it costs too much to get more kids that way. But I'm going to say that's wrong. Because if we think about, say, that baby bonus, an 11 million won baby bonus, for those who don't think in terms of won, that's about 20% of GDP per capita. So that's like saying you get 20% of a typical salary just for having a baby, just cash check right off the bat. Okay. That 11 million won baby bonus would cost, like I said, only 0.1% of GDP. That is not actually very much money in the grand scheme of things. So let's do a little hypothetical. What if Korea committed to spending 15% of government spending on a baby bonus? That's about 4% of GDP. So what if Korea said, we're going to try and spend about as much on baby bonuses as we do on pensions? What would happen then? This would be a 168 million won baby bonus. That's the equivalent of 4 years of salary just for having a baby. Okay, just right off the bat. So that's a huge gift to families. What would that do? Well, that would raise fertility to about 1.9 children per woman, almost replacement rate. Now, that's a lot of money. 4% of GDP, that's not nothing. But also, if you ask me, would you be willing to pay 4% of GDP to save your country from extinction? I would say yes. I would pay it in a heartbeat. So it is a lot of money. It's not so much. Now, there might be other reasons we don't want to do that. You might worry about moral hazard. Maybe if you just give people huge amounts of money to have babies, they'll abuse the system somehow. Maybe this will ruin workplace participation. People won't want to work. Maybe this will result in too much public debt. Okay, so there might be other reasons you don't want to spend that much money. But the point is, yes, it could be done. But there is a second path. If we think what we should really do is target marriage, we might wonder, how can we do that? And the first way is to target marriage. Now, I only looked at this for about an hour to figure out what are Korea's policies in these areas. And right off the bat, I found at least 6 different policies that have marriage penalties baked into them. There's a spouse deduction that right now does not fully equalize the treatment of spouses. There's a female taxpayer deduction that particularly discourages women from marrying. There's a household income means test for the earned income tax credit. There's these other programs, the lone parent support subsidy, the basic livelihood subsidy. There's at least 6 different programs where I was able to find in just an hour of looking that there are marriage penalties. So finding ways to get rid of marriage penalties so that people don't lose benefits just for getting married is important. But there is another interesting quirk here, and that is that little increase in Korean fertility in the last 2 years. It's gone up ever so slightly. What's happening there? That's weird. That's interesting. Well, starting in 2024, Korea rolled out a 1 million won bonus for marriage. In the year you get married, the family is paid 1 million won. That was in 2024. It lasts until 2026. Here are 2 different measures of the marriage rate in Korea. One's the crude marriage rate. The other's the total marriage rate, which is controlling for the number of unmarried people exposed to marriage. And you can see as soon as this policy was implemented, marriage rates rose up immediately. I think what that tells you is that Koreans are willing to marry if the financial package of marriage looks good, if it looks like a good deal. So cash for marriage might have some of the same problems. Okay, there might be adverse selection or moral hazard or other kinds of public cost issues that we are concerned about. But at the end of the day, it can happen. You can subsidize marriage and get more for it. Now, as Dan was mentioning earlier, cultural, social, religious influences matter a lot. They arguably matter more than finances. The problem is they're very hard to study because we almost never measure them. So this year in 2026 at the Institute for Family Studies, we are going to measure them. If you look in places like the International Social Survey Program, the World Values Survey, the General Social Survey, they often have none of the relevant questions we would want to ask about the cultural influences on fertility. What would your mother-in-law think of you having kids? What would your friends think of it? Do you think kids in your country have a good childhood these days? Would you be happy having kids? These kinds of broader cultural questions about family are almost never asked. So we're going to ask them. In the 2026 IFS Global Fertility Culture Survey, we are going to be surveying respondents in at least 6 or 8 countries, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the US. We're hoping to also do some European and maybe Middle Eastern countries. We're going to be asking these questions about school experiences and upbringing and friendships and social media, coworkers, all these different cultural and social influences that we know impact fertility, but we have a hard time measuring. And we're going to figure out what specifically about certain cultures generates pro or anti-natal results. And the reason I bring this up is not just to say, wouldn't it be cool if we knew these things, but we'd love for people to join our work. The survey is going to begin in April, but we need more partners to reach our target sample size. We'd love to have a very big survey. Right now, it's going to be a moderately sized survey. We'd love it to be even bigger. So if you or a government near you is interested in partnering with the survey program to get better cultural data on family and fertility and social influences on fertility and how we might be able to encourage births without spending insane amounts of money, then please get in touch with me so that we can talk about this. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was a deep dive. Actually, we can see that the demographic study involves a lot of factors, and there's a lot of ways you can go with that. Wow. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stone. In our remaining time, we'll have a discussion. For Roger Weatherall, he's been monitoring the chat. If he has a couple questions that you've spotlighted that might be valuable for our discussion, especially in the area. I know there was some about housing as well and problems for barriers for marriage.
Yes, so we have a number of good questions in here. So I'm going to start off with a cultural question, which kind of a few people had this. How can we create a culture that promotes pronatal attitudes and practices? This is a question from Andy, but it reflects the sentiments of a number of other people here. So culture. How do we create culture, guys?
Yeah, please speak up, anyone.
Let's bring people on the screen.
Dr. Stone, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Delano just said. I think that's a lot of that is right on. What we're looking at, we have kind of a mental model. I jokingly call it the crowbar model. So Policy can't inspire people to have kids. I survey all the time asking people things about fertility. And we ask them, why did you have kids? Why do you want kids? If you had kids, what do you expect to get out of it? All these different questions. And no one ever said, well, the child tax credit is why I had kids. Like, that's just not an answer that respondents give. They say, oh, I wanted to see what kind of person me and my spouse would make. Or I wanted to experience childhood through my kids' eyes. Or I wanted to continue my family lineage. People have a million reasons. It actually makes it very difficult to survey this topic because the reasons people do have kids are way more diverse than the reasons they don't. The reasons they don't have kids are very precise often. But my point on this is people already have intrinsic motivations to have children. And then stuff gets in the way. Sometimes the stuff is material or financial or whatever, but often cultural stuff gets in the way. Maybe there's someone that they should marry. Maybe there's somebody they would like to marry, but their community around them is not encouraging that. It's encouraging them to keep their options open. And that's a cultural barrier. So the way we think about this is, what is it that we want policy to do? We want policy not to try and lift the burden and give people reasons to have kids. We think about policy as reinforcing the cultural actors who already supply intrinsic motivations. So, for example, a very important policy, if you want fertility to go up, is probably some version of school choice allowing parents to put their kids in religious schools. Okay, that's like probably important because religion is probably important for fertility. Thinking about the role of marriage generally. Thinking about housing. What we want to be doing is we want a pastor speaking to his congregation to feel confident saying, in this church, we want people to have babies. We want to support you. And also, look, I know some of you are worried about finances, but now the state voucher will cover the cost of our parish school. Or we want a mother-in-law to be able to say to her daughter or son-in-law, look, I know it's expensive, but nowadays, if I babysit your kid, I can claim like an extra 5% on my Social Security pension top up. And it counts for that. Like, it counts as like a thing I'm doing that the government will reward me for. So I'm going to watch your kid for 16 hours a week. We can do things that give the actual cultural actors involved here incentives to use the influence they have. So like, I love the idea of like the LeBron James ad, or the one I talk about is like, it would be worth it to pay Taylor Swift $1 billion for a lullaby album for her first baby. Like, it would be worth every penny. Okay. But like, ultimately, we've got to find ways where there are cultural actors who are already motivated in these areas, where we can, in sort of a cost-effective way, get them to leverage the motivation they have. And that's why I talk a lot about marriage penalties, because the most motivated actors of all are young people who really just want to get married and have babies with each other. But I personally know multiple young people in my life who would like to get married and would like to have kids, and they're not getting married because they would lose all these tax and welfare benefits. Okay. And yeah, they might have had one kid together when they're not married, but the choice to keep having kids, to go on and have more, to be stably there, really is about marriage, right? You might have a whoopsie as your first, but you're unlikely to just keep going and form a stable family without marriage. And you don't get marriage when you have marriage penalties. So the model I think about this is not that it's culture or money. Okay. Money and culture, money makes culture and culture makes money. Okay. So like, I love the Heritage proposal of like this basically investment fund for marriage, because like, it's hard to find the money to pay for good pronatal policy. But if you're leveraging the high returns of the free market to pay for pronatal policy, like, that's a great idea. And so what are you doing? You're finding, okay, these people already want to get married, and you're just giving them a little more leverage, right? The person in the couple who really wants to get married more can kind of nudge the other one and say, hey, if we did this, look at all the money we'd get. So that's the mental model here. Yes, it's culture. Culture can be shaped by financial incentives. We're not thinking about financial incentives as creating reasons to have kids, but as creating leverage for the people who already have reasons.
We have another question here about Israel, and a couple of people put some comments in the chat as well. So maybe this is to Dan first up. What is the childcare situation in Israel? And do you think that that has contributed to the high marriage rates and child rates there as well? Does childcare in general have an impact? And then maybe Lyman, you can also jump in on this.
Well, I know what Lyman's going to say already because we've talked about that a lot. So I don't want to steal his thunder. But I do think that very broadly across Israeli society, and this is something that I tried to emphasize in my presentation, there is just a really profound sense of the value of life. That doesn't quite answer that question, but that's something that's really profound that I think we need to appreciate about Israel and kind of inherit and understand that, because that can really power pronatalism from a lot of different angles. And I really appreciated Delano's point about how we, there's not going to be one pronatal culture, but there will be many, and it may come from a lot of different angles. But I think really having an intense appreciation that the humanity, that the people are a positive, a good thing, and that having more people is a good thing in general is a wonderful starting point that can really, translate and port across many different subcultures and can really allow 1,000 flowers to bloom in terms of many different pronatal cultures that we need. But I want to then hand it over to Lyman because I know he has a very precise answer actually about Israel and childcare.
No, I mean, Dan's absolutely right that, I mean, Israel has unique cultural things going on. Or Dan will also often make this point about Mongolia, right? I put Mongolia in my presentation just to mess with Dan. But
we're friends. We're friends.
But there are obviously unique cultural things going on here in any of these cases. But yeah, Israel does have a very generous childcare subsidy system. And people tend to live close to their families, and they have strong religiously informed norms of alloparental care. So parents in Israel report, in surveys, they report more receipt of free childcare, just like other people watching their kids, than people in almost any other industrialized country in the world. And I just can't imagine that doesn't make some difference. Israel does have really, really generous tax and spending benefits for having kids, similar to how France dramatically reduces your tax rate for each kid you have. Israel has a similar system, with the result that the Haredi essentially don't pay any taxes, even if they do earn income. So, which is a problem for them at some extreme. This becomes a fiscal problem. So Israel definitely has unique cultural things happening, but yeah, they have an extensive, both subsidized and culturally provided childcare system that makes parenting a lot easier in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
I've been doing some research with economists, and they've clearly, there's budget problems. If you have a declining population, you have budget problems to fund infrastructure, also climate change. Some people think a declining population is good for the planet, but this economist said no, because you lose the funds to really do a lot of things to infrastructure, and you need capital needs. So there's significant economic issues, right? And I know you guys are not economists, but I'm sure Delano and Lyman, you talk to economists in your fields. What do you hear them saying as to the truth of this, that it's a real economic crisis? Either one of you want to share anything you've heard about?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in some. It amazes me still that we find people who don't think that there's a huge economic problem here. I mean, who does most of the inventing and patenting? And Dan correctly pointed out certain countries do it. Okay, yes, so places with good educational systems and a lot of really high human capital. But in those countries, who does it? Younger people. I mean, science advances at the pace of one death of tenured faculty at a time. Just the simple reality is that young people drive technological innovation, productivity growth, adoption of new products, scaling of new products. I mean, look, I'm already at the stage where a new product comes out and I'm like, I don't want to try that. I like the stuff I already have. I can't imagine how bad it's going to be in a few more years for me. So innovation, productivity growth, the seeds of our prosperity are in human capital, but particularly young human capital. Beyond that, there's scale effects. I mean, you know, it's very difficult to justify the types of big investments, like say in data centers. Okay, data centers only pencil out if you have a massive market to sell these, AI assisted tools to. Okay, but this is, where a lot of our future productivity growth is going to come from is this kinds of like robotic and AI assisted work. But that only makes sense if the population of humans that are going to buy it is still growing, right? If the population of humans that are going to buy all the services that the robots and the AIs are making falls by 30%, then data centers are crappy investments. Okay, there's just not going to be people to buy all the stuff. And you could do this across any investment. Virtually the entirety of capitalist investment really does rest on the idea that humanity's not done yet. And like, it sounds crazy that you have to say that. Like, yes, investment only makes sense if there's really a next generation to buy it. But that really is the case. And if it's not there, and then of course you can talk about Social Security and pensions and all that, intergenerational transfers that are more explicit. But it's worth realizing that Social Security, these pensions, they're explicit, but the entire economy works like that, of young people creating the fruits of productivity and productive labor that children and old people depend upon for their survival.
Yeah. Innovation, productivity. Roger says he has one more good question, and then we may move to wrap things up.
Okay, I have about 3 more good questions, but you
too
want me to
many.
choose one? Okay. All right.
We've kept these guys here a long time.
Walter Lowe had a really good comment in a good question there that he was asking about are we at risk of turning children into a commodity if we are offering, money to parents to have children or to get married even, could that result in people getting married just to get that and then getting divorced and, this kind of stuff and just causing greater problems. And this actually ties into my question. What should our target growth rate be? Should it be 2.1? Should it be 5 kids? Should we set a target? Should we be like the FDA targeting like 2.1% inflation rate every year? What are your thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't mind, making one point, which is that actually, a lot of conservatives in particular are kind of reluctant to, spend any money on children because of, the maybe moral hazard or what have you. We live in a society, almost the United States is this way, almost every developed country is this way already, which is that, senior citizens are massively advantaged, financially and in many ways in terms of social spending, and actually the young are at a massive, baseline disadvantage. If you look at the amount of spending, on the elderly, it is an order of magnitude greater. Almost, it isn't not just in the United States. In a lot of European nations, it's even more lopsided. In France, I think, I was seeing something where retirees are earning more money from their pensions than the average worker is getting for their hardworking salary. So you have, supporting, families or having, social spending on the young, doesn't even have to be seen as, some kind of moral hazard subsidy, but it can actually be seen as, just rebalancing something that is incredibly skewed as a baseline against the young right now. So that's another more helpful way to think about it. So I'll yield the rest of my time here.
Thank you, Audrey, for being with us today. I hope it was very, very helpful. We had some tremendous advice here from our panelists. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.